Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. The locals here call it Mosi Watunya, which means the smoke that thunders. The people living in the area of the spectacular Victoria Falls were not isolated from the outside world. Southern Africans were involved many centuries ago in trade with people from other parts of the world. We know this from oral tradition and archaeological evidence of goods from across continents. In this episode, we look at some of the great kingdoms of Southern Africa, including the towering civilization of Great Zimbabwe, and see how African rulers put up fierce resistance to the Portuguese and at times succeeded in keeping the Europeans at bay. These dancers and drummers at a market in the Zambian capital, Lusaka, are an ethnic performance group that represents some of the main ethnicities in Zambia today. They have much in common with one another and with people in other parts of Southern Africa, including those who built Great Zimbabwe. Before we pick up the history of Great Zimbabwe, we need to go back a little to see what gave rise to it. In the late Iron Age, which is around the 9th century, communities in Southern Africa lived mainly from agriculture and fishing. By the 10th century, the remaining hunter-gatherers were either absorbed by agricultural communities or pushed out of the region. And crucially, people began to keep cattle. Cattle were, and still are, a major source of wealth and, by extension, of social control. And cattle were actually used as a form of currency for bridal dowries and even for trading. And the more cattle you had, the wealthier and more powerful you were.
Cattle was the biggest economy. It was the form of money, so to speak, or to say it was the bank. So the cattle economy was very wide, and most groups or ethnic groups in Southern Africa had cattle. And that was the driving force of conquering areas because they would be looking for cattle.
There was cattle for meat and cattle for milk, but some societies would rather have been eating vegetables than killing a cattle, because if you kill your cattle, then you are becoming less wealthy. So you find that people would rather have large herds of cattle, but they are killing them as food.
By about the late 10th or early 11th century, a cattle-keeping culture developed known as Leopard's Kopje after the site where it was first identified. This formed the bedrock for the kingdoms that developed later. This civilization was based in modern-day Zimbabwe and covered parts of what are now Zambia, Mozambique, South Africa, Malawi, and Botswana. The people also farmed and terraced hillsides to prevent the erosion of fertile soils. Food was plentiful. Today, Southern Africa is known for its deposits of valuable metals like gold, and this was the case centuries ago. Mining for precious metals was present as early as the 10th century. Miners would dig shafts as deep as 30 meters or more. Young children were often used to go deeper into the shafts. We know this because the skeletons of children have been found. It's likely that the wealthy elites would have forced people to go down the mines to obtain the precious metals.
In fact, when we talk about mining, these early people that lived in Southern Africa were people that also were aware and were conversant with the value of certain minerals, and they transformed some of these minerals into artifacts which people valued. So they were doing their own small types of mining, and that is also part of what directed later people to say, you know, where are these kind of minerals coming from, and to go and mine this. So much of the mining that was done in the early years was normally along river banks. When it rains and as water was flowing, it was exposing some of the minerals. So the people were able to distinguish an ordinary rock from a mineral that was worth taking to smelt and make artifacts out of them.
The Lepidskopier culture reached its height about 1075 at Mapungubwe in the north of modern-day South Africa. The people here established a network of stone settlements that became power bases for regional councillors. The elites grew rich from the sale of ivory, gold and copper and lived in clay-built houses. The king or paramount chief had both religious and political authority. The remote and rugged hill was a sacred site where ordinary people were not allowed to venture. We know Mapungubwe traded with Europe, India, China and Arabia because goods from these places have been found there, like these Chinese ceramics dating back to the 13th or 14th century. The people at Mapungubwe also made their own exquisite objects, and some dating from the 13th century are on display at the museum in Pretoria, like this wooden rhino covered in gold flake, a model of a cow, a gold headdress that looks like a cup, and a small golden staff. These were used by the rulers of Mapungubwe and show what a sophisticated culture they had. But their tombs were looted in years gone by, losing us much vital information. Cedric Setlako is a guide at Mapungubwe and has a deep attachment to the region where he lives.
What these people, had for a living, they had to hunt, and they had plowing fields, sorghum, millet, and grain beans. We're talking an estimated population of about 5,000 people who occupied the Mapungubwe Valley, and only less than 50 people that occupied the hilltop, which is the royal family, and probably the guards and the servants as well. What the people did 1,000 years ago when they occupied the site, in order for them to be able to get up to the top, they actually had to cut the holes on both sides on the rock to anchor tree branches across for a stepping ladder to get up there. That still remains the only route to get to the top. So also up on top of this hill, you still find, holes like this, and that one there. All over this hilltop. These are the holes the people of Mapungubwe would use to anchor the poles. That is for their huts and the shades, for the structures basically, just for support. All this gold that we're talking about was actually found in the burials. That is right on top of the Mapungubwe hill. Gold was only found only on top of the hill. And that was in the graves. And those are the graves that contained all these golden artifacts that we have. The golden rhino, the golden bowl, the golden scepter. And there were also clay pots that were found in those graves. Some of these clay pots also contained beads in them.
The Kingdom of Mapungubwe was the first stage in the cultural development of the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe. It laid down the economic and political foundations for it. Sometime in the 13th century, Mapungubwe became absorbed by Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe is one of the most famous historic sites in Africa and is located 240 kilometers east of Bulawayo in modern-day Zimbabwe. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe built on the stone masonry traditions of Mapungubwe and established elaborate settlements to display their wealth, power, and prestige. The kingdom's capital was the city of Great Zimbabwe, which spans an area of more than 7 square kilometers. At its peak in the 14th century, it may have housed around 18,000 people. The roughly 7-meter-high great enclosure was built without mortar and is therefore unique in the whole of Africa. Great Zimbabwe was built for a succession of rulers who became rich and powerful through trade. And these collection of ruins are the largest in Africa south of the Sahara. And they are testament to a culture of immense wealth and great architectural skill. It's reckoned that around 1 million stone bricks, weighing about 15,000 tons, were needed for the main walls alone. And by the way, Zimbabwe means house of stone in the Shona language of the people who still inhabit the area. One of the main sources of wealth for Great Zimbabwe was the fact that it was a thoroughfare for all trade in gold and ivory from the interior of Africa to the southeastern coast. The GHA, the General History of Africa, compiled by UNESCO, on which the series bases its facts, states that the famous stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe fueled the sometimes extravagant imagination of foreign writers and visitors who could not believe it was built by Africans. This is one example that illustrates this, the words of James Theodore Bent, an English explorer, archaeologist and writer.
A prehistoric race built the ruins, a northern race coming from Arabia, closely akin to the Phoenician and Egyptian, and eventually developing into the more civilized races of the ancient world.
Zimbabwean academic George Carrick-Waivanane is currently teaching African history at Edinburgh University in Scotland. He was born in an area very close to Great Zimbabwe.
Many Europeans who saw the majesty and splendor of the Great Zimbabwe just couldn't imagine that Africans could have built this. They came up with many theories about the Phoenicians having come and all those sorts of spurious theories. But in fact, these are impressive structures that were built by African people using African intellect and African innovation.
So the reality is that Great Zimbabwe was constructed according to age-old architectural principles and made from local raw materials. But we cannot be sure exactly who built it, according to Zimbabwean professor Ngwabi Bebe. He's one of the main contributors to the General History of Africa, and we meet at the site of Great Zimbabwe.
It is very important to always remember when we are talking about the builders of Zimbabwe that we should not quickly identify these ruins with a particular ethnic group within Southern Africa, because the ethnic groups were migrating. Recently, we have discovered that some societies which are associated with some of the remains that we have found here, very early on, really migrated to South Africa and back again. So it was not a straightforward one route or one directional migration, but the people migrated to and from. We know that they would have lived in wattle and mud huts, apart from the stones that we are looking at, the great stones that they've built. The wattle and mud huts have been found, their remains up there.
So the gold, the fact that they had this gold, would have made them extremely rich and powerful.
Very powerful indeed. But remember, these people basically were cattle keepers, and all this area is very small, and speculation is that the cattle would not have all been kept within this area, but would have been kept in distant areas from here, being farmed to communities which would have been conquered by the chiefs living up here.
The kings of Great Zimbabwe asserted their dominance over their neighbors through their military prowess, and this meant they could increase their wealth by forcing people to pay taxes, which cemented their hold on power. And as if to emphasize their lofty status, they chose to live high up, well away from their subjects. Here on the hilltop fortress, archaeologists have found spearheads which were the symbols of great power. And down below you can see the great enclosure where the senior wife lived with her own entourage and children. And whichever wife was on duty would come up here to spend time with the king. It's believed that about 8 kings lived here at Great Zimbabwe with their warriors and close relatives. One king, Mutota, reportedly had 200 wives.
You see, the king would have been not an ordinary king. He would have had also some priestly powers, just like other African kings that we have found out elsewhere in Africa. He would have been in the great enclosure with so many hangers-on, so many assistants and so on. So many priests would have assisted him.
It's believed that the last king of Great Zimbabwe was King Mutota, who apparently had 200 wives. Have you heard of that story?
Yes.
Do you think it's true?
Mutota is associated with many stories. He is the guy who is supposed to have taken a large army and migrated northwards. And his army was so large that it was likened to insects. When they got to the Zambezi Valley, they got there and just took over the entire place.
In the mid-15th century, King Mutota left the kingdom and travelled north. He went in search of salt, a very valuable commodity, and he defeated other communities along the way. He established a new independent dynasty called Mutapa at Chitakochangonia Hill in northern Zimbabwe. Over the following years, Great Zimbabwe's resources became depleted. Trade routes also gradually shifted northwards, and Great Zimbabwe was eventually abandoned in the latter half of the 15th century.
Great Zimbabwe is thought to have gone into decline for a number of reasons. First of all, there would have been cattle keepers, massive herds of cattle, and this would have been overgrazed over a time. Number 2, our people eat a lot of salt. I'm told the Zimbabweans are extraordinary eaters of salt, and much of it was collected from the soil. It ran out within this region. And so that's hence some theories that they migrated to the Zambezi Valley. The third reason is that it just became overpopulated. So again, the environment might have been overexploited. And then there was also the movement of trade northwards. The kings moved northwards to go and control that trade.
After the break, the new kingdoms that arose after the decline of Great Zimbabwe and how their rulers had to fight off Europeans intent on seizing their riches. In the late 15th century, after Great Zimbabwe was abandoned, it was the Kingdom of Mutapa which became the dominant force in the region. This may not have had magnificent ruins by which we can remember it, but it was a great kingdom which stretched across portions of modern-day Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Mozambique. King Mutota of the Mutapa Kingdom settled amongst the Shona people in what is today Mozambique. He became known as Lord of the Metals, and with his son Matope quickly established control over the people in the region. Surrounding states were encouraged to join Mutapa voluntarily in exchange for a position in the Great Council. Mutota's kingdom was rich in agricultural resources and well positioned for trade with neighboring settlements, who benefited from economic ties with it. One example of a settlement that traded with Mutapa was Ingombe Ilede in modern-day Zambia, about 150 kilometers south of the capital, Lusaka. To get to this remote area, I make my way on a car journey that takes me through sparsely inhabited terrain where there's a stark collection of baobab trees. Apart from providing a feast for the eyes with their striking beauty, these trees also provide a little tasty snack. The fruit of the baobab is rich in vitamin C. The site of Ingombe Ilede was excavated by archaeologists around 1960, and this is what provides us with information about the settlement. Archaeological discoveries have been made here of textiles, ceramics, gold and copper ore dating from the 7th to the 16th century. And this would indicate that there was a small commercial state or chiefdom that existed here, and it's believed that salt was its principal trading item. The people here really reached the height of their civilization between the 13th and 16th centuries, when they traded with the kingdom of Matopa. Now, there is a fallen baobab tree, which is a monument to the site of Ngombe Ilede, which actually in the local Tonga language means the cow that sleeps. And if you look at the monument, I suppose from a certain angle, it does rather look like a cow that's sleeping. Have a look and see what you think. Ingombe Ilede is near Lake Kariba on the border of Zambia and Zimbabwe. The area north of here has for centuries been inhabited by the Tonga people. Many of them are still here today. Their ancestors would have lived in the small states, chiefdoms and kingdoms in this part of Africa. All's well that ends well. The Mutapa Kingdom was not the only one to arise out of the disintegration of Great Zimbabwe. The rival Tora dynasty established the Butua Kingdom in what is today southwestern Zimbabwe. Its capital was in Kami, just outside modern-day Bulawayo. Kami is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its ruins display some of the fine stone masonry traditions of Great Zimbabwe. Built on a hilltop, Kami is spread over 2 kilometers and is made up of a series of dry stone-walled structures displaying a high standard of workmanship. The Tora royal family lived in the built-up areas. Open spaces were for ordinary people. The Kingdom of Batura at Kami had extensive trade links, and a range of imported artifacts have been discovered. This is a fragment from a Chinese porcelain object which dates between the 14th and 16th century. At around the same time that Kami was established, outsiders were becoming increasingly drawn to this part of southern Africa. By the late 15th century, the Portuguese had arrived. They did not immediately go on the offensive and indeed paid tribute to rulers for the use of their trade routes. In fact, the powerful Mutapa Kingdom developed a comparatively strong and friendly relationship with the Portuguese.
The Portuguese were attracted to this part of Africa because of the wealth, the ivory and the gold especially. So they were coming in there, especially to do a lot of gold trading. So there was a lot of trade that was happening between the kingdoms in this part of what is present-day Zimbabwe.
And the Portuguese wanted a slice of the action.
Indeed, the Portuguese, and this is why when you look at the Portuguese presence in the area, a lot of it was trading posts, which were helped in terms of enforcement by a bit of the military, but a lot of it was really trade, and they wanted a piece of that action, as you say.
However, this relative peace was not to last. By the early 1570s, the Portuguese were frustrated by restrictions on their trading activities, and so they began an all-out invasion on the Mutapa Kingdom. The Portuguese soldiers were quickly defeated by disease, drought, and determined resistance from the locals. As such, Mutapa ended the 16th century as the dominant power in the region. But a conflict of interests had been exposed, which later paved the way for European domination. In the mid-1680s, a new power arose on the Zimbabwean plateau, led by a military ruler called Changamire Dombo. He rebelled against the Mutapa Kingdom and defeated them in 1684. He then established a new domain known as the Rosvi Empire.
Changamire was a title. It was a title that was given to the Rosvi king. And in terms of how he started, what we have been told is that he was a herdsman. He was a lowly person who arose as a herdsman of the Mutapa. And he gained favor with the king. And after gaining favor, he was given a grant of a lot of land. However, after a while, he then rebelled against the Mutapa king. And after rebelling, he fled to the south. And during his flee to the south, that's when he began to conquer a number of communities around in that area. And then that's it when he began to build what we now know as the Rosvi Kingdom.
The influence of Rosvi extended over much of present-day Zimbabwe, northeastern South Africa, and perhaps westwards into Botswana. The Rosvi Empire did not want to depend on trade for wealth and survival. It wanted to be more self-reliant. So the people were very active in agriculture, cattle rearing, hunting, and fishing. Changamire Dombo fought the Portuguese, leading to years of struggle with them.
I think one of the key things about Changamire Dombo's reputation is as a superior military strategist, tactician. He was seen to be a cunning military strategist, and this is, I think, in part because of the fact that he had defeated the Portuguese. He clashed with them a number of times during the late 17th century.
What was the nature of the military engagement he had with the Portuguese? Were these fully armed Portuguese soldiers?
For the most part, he was dealing with Portuguese trading posts. So to be fair, the victory was partly due to the disciplined and trained nature of the Roji army. But I think it should be said as well that the Portuguese were at this time trying to fend off the Sultan of Oman on the East African coast. So he was not really dealing with the full force of the Portuguese at this time. And for the most part, these were, you might call them trading posts of the Portuguese. But what we do know is that the defeats were convincing enough for the Portuguese to actually recognize the Roji as the rulers of this area, and to some extent were paying tribute to the Roji people.
Changamire Dombo's combined economic and military might gave him a fearsome and powerful reputation, and he almost completely removed the Portuguese from the areas he controlled. His control of the gold trade became absolute because he conquered the mineral-rich lands in the region. But Changamire Dombo died in 1695, not long after his military successes. One can only speculate about what might have happened had he lived longer.
Historians are notoriously coy about making predictions about the future. But I think one of the effects of Changamire Dombo's early demise was the fact that the kingdom began to be rocked by a lot of succession disputes. And I think this must have affected the strength of the kingdom. So some have suggested that only once was the succession peaceful, and repeated succession disputes must have definitely weakened the kingdom and affected its ability to repel the intrusions by other people who were coming into the Zimbabwean plateau. And the second reason was that there was an incursion from the south by another group, which then took over the area to the southwest of Zimbabwe and essentially led to the decline of the Roji state.
What would you say is the significance historically of Changamire Dombo?
I think Changamire Dombo is one of those important characters that are often missing in our understanding of African history. We're most often taught about Africa as a place, a dark continent, a place without a history, a primitive place, and yet we find it was actually populated by people of great political cunning, military strategists, people who were able to put together important and significant polities, kingdoms that were able to hold forth for over a century in the region. So I think he is one of those important missing figures we don't talk enough about in African history.
With their major foe out of the picture, the Portuguese managed to hang on to their trading posts and began to entrench themselves increasingly in the region. By the first half of the 1800s, the Rosvi Empire gradually began to disintegrate. The Portuguese built this fort in Maputo, which they called Lourenço Marques, to defend their position and interests in this part of Africa. But they had not yet subdued local rulers. After the decline of the Rosvi Empire in the 1830s, another kingdom arose, that of Gaza. It extended from the lower Zambezi River to just south of the Limpopo River and included parts of modern-day South Africa and Zimbabwe. The Gaza Kingdom was founded by Soshangané, who ruled in the 1830s to 1858. This is a representation of an etching of Soshangané from one of the General History of Africa volumes. He's portrayed gathering his men in preparation for the collection of taxes.
So Soshangané, we are told, was a general of the Ndwandwe people in present-day South Africa. He started to migrate northwards into what is now present-day Mozambique. And when he arrived in that area, he began to establish his kingdom. And then the kingdom began to consolidate and spread across what is now present-day Mozambique, South Africa, and parts of Zimbabwe. The Gaza Kingdom was able to repel the Portuguese on a number of occasions.
Soshangane considerably weakened the power of the Portuguese, and the centre of his kingdom was in southern Mozambique, which includes the modern capital city of Maputo. But by the 1880s, the Gaza kingdom went into economic decline because large numbers of young men were migrating to work in the diamond mines of Kimberley in South Africa. And this deprived the rulers of Gaza of both labour and revenue. By the end of the 19th century, the Gaza kingdom had disintegrated, and this bronze relief at the fort in the capital Maputo shows Portuguese soldiers clearly subduing the citizens of Gaza. The Portuguese military governor, Muzino de Albuquerque, defeated the last king of Gaza, Ugungane, at a battle in 1895. Thereafter, the king was deported to Europe. Moise Timber is the curator of the fortress in Maputo.
Ngungunyane, quando foi vencido por Muzinho de Albuquerque em 1895, já em 1940 ergueu-se monumento de exaltação a Muzinho de Albuquerque. Parte desse monumento tinha painéis ali que representavam a humilhação, a prisão de Ngungunyane.
So Moses, you're bringing me to see the coffin, the tomb of King Ngunyane, and here it is. His body was returned, wasn't it, to Mozambique when the country became independent in 1975 from Portugal, where he had fled.
Yes. Esta é a urna realmente de Ngunyane após a sua prisão, deportação para os Açores em 1896. Ele teria morrido lá em 1906. A maioria da população considera Ngungunyane como um herói da resistência contra a ocupação e dominação colonial estrangeira e portuguesa de uma forma particular. Ele teria sido preso num contexto de resistência, num contexto de defesa contra a escravidão, contra o trabalho forçado, contra a humilhação externa e opunha essas pretensões portuguesas de ocupação e colonização desta região. Então, a abordagem que nós temos da maioria é que ele foi um herói da resistência.
The Portuguese were now the dominant power in what became Mozambique until the country's independence in 1975. They left a large footprint on the country, the Portuguese language, the Catholic religion, and buildings like the fort at Maputo. The kingdoms covered in this episode are examples of the sophisticated, thriving, and rich civilizations established by the people of southern Africa. It's a history that's not been widely related or has been told from the European perspective, partly because of a lack of written African records.
We say to ourselves, it's not just the written record that can be a clue to our history. First of all, it's the oral traditions that are found in all the families that are all over Zimbabwe, all over South Africa.
All over Africa.
All over Africa. And those oral traditions, when they are properly used and analyzed, can give us so much clue as to what happened in the past. Then there is the archaeology, of course. The archaeology that was also carried out here. And in the colonial period, there was so much that was done.
When you were at school, what were you told about the civilization or the people who built Great Zimbabwe?
Nothing.
Nothing at all.
Nothing at all.
It was just ignored.
It was ignored.
When did you find out about it?
When I became a professor.
So that was relatively late in life.
That was relatively late in life. I must confess honestly. It was late in life.
That you found out about this extraordinary historical monument.
Very exciting when I went to class to start teaching about the rise of Great Zimbabwe and the rise of the Monomotapa Empire and the rise of the Rosary Kingdoms and so on. It became very exciting.
It's being taught what you are putting together will tell if that meeting is for elders. When we look at the history of Africa, it's like a chosen few went into the books of history, while the other very powerful kingdoms, powerful kings, and systems that didn't put them down and write about them. So the emphasis really was elsewhere, because I think Europe was so much interested in the wealth and not necessarily in the people per se, but they were powerful kingdoms.
Those ancient kingdoms remind me of the fact that African civilizations were present, and they were dynamic. It was an era of creativity. There was so much that was happening. So I think recovering the history of these southern kingdoms casts a new light on African history and recovers those kind of kingdoms that we don't know enough about, that were important and dynamic societies that had diversified economies, sophisticated political systems, and complex urban areas with impressive architecture like the Great Zimbabwe.
So the pride is evident in this aspect of African history, not only for the people of southern Africa, but indeed the whole of the continent. The young in downtown Maputo let rip with their dancing. They can be confident in the knowledge that their forefathers and mothers are drawn from the same group of people who built some of the great civilizations on the continent. A history they can share and revel in. In the next episode, we look at one of the most famous of West Africa's kingdoms, the Asante of Ghana, and how they've maintained their traditions, culture, and heritage despite the onslaught of colonial domination.